Hello there, and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers. And what on earth is going on Fulgora over here? There's something very strange growing. Well, let's take a look into it. So you might remember that a couple of videos ago I discovered we weren't making science packs anymore over on Fulgora and started to trace back the problem. And it was over here, we weren't making the science packs. Okay, so why was that? It turned out to be because we didn't have any electrolyte coming in, and then when we followed that back, it turned out we didn't have any of the liquid holmium coming through, and that was because we didn't have any sand coming up here, because we didn't have any stone coming through here to be made into the sand. And as you can tell, it's been partially fixed now. We're still a little bit shorter on stone than we'd like to be, so I think a little bit more work might be required in expansion in this area, but the basic system is now up and working. But it turned out that we didn't have any stone because there'd been a recipe change, and due to adding in an additional mod because people told us that Fulgora wasn't really quite the same without it, we no longer have stone coming out when we recycle scrap, and this has caused us a bit of a problem, as you can imagine, given that we need quite a lot of stone. And so I came over to this planet to have a look into what was going on, and well, the first thought was, can we recycle any of these things along here into stone or into sand? And concrete feels sort of slightly stony, but if you recycle it, then all you get out is stone, brick and iron ore. If you try and recycle a stone brick, then actually, to be fair, you do get sand back, so we could get a bit of sand from that. But we were already, well, at least at the time, we were pretty short of concrete as well, so we didn't really want to start throwing that away. And that does explain why we're getting a load of sand out of the top here, which is something I was wondering about during the stream, so I'm glad I looked into that, so we can go in and fix that at some point. So I guess we'll pull the sand through from here, and that does mean that any excess concrete we have will provide a bit of sand, but still it probably wouldn't have been enough. And so I hunted around a bit in the recipe systems and worked out what the new mod was, and it turns out we've now got this extra system we can do on Fulgora called Coralmium growing, and so we can grow this Coralmium over here. It grows in the oil, so it doesn't take up a great deal of land, but we do need to put the agricultural towers right on the edge in order for them to be able to grow it, which is a little bit awkward but not unmanageable. I guess in the future, in theory, we'd build out a row of foundation if we got any, and then maybe we put our agricultural towers somewhere like this where we get a huge amount of coverage and we'd be able to get a lot more grown per tower. But to be honest, I suspect it's probably cheaper just to put in lots and lots of extra towers around the edge of this island where we've got this shallow oil that we can grow in. So for example, down here we could put one on the edge of here, especially if we blew up some of these cliffs, get a load more from here. There's plenty of space down here, plenty of potential, maybe even over on some of the islands if we can be bothered to then start training it in. Or over here there's loads of potential space, growing space over here as well. So there's a lot of areas where we could actually start growing some more of the Coralmium, but for now we'll just see if this is actually enough and whether we can catch up with it. And when you grow Coralmium, well, eventually these sort of coral tree things grow, and they seem to be a little bit wibbly in the sun, but sure, why not? And like most plants, they're grown from a seed, and when they grow to their full size, they get harvested like every other tree in the game does. They produce a quantity of Coralmium, which we can then unload onto the belt, and that can be fed into recyclers down here, where it then gets chewed through and turned into lots and lots of different things. This produces a quantity of the seeds to allow us to regrow the trees, and I worked out you get 50 Coralmium out for each piece of coral you harvest, and so that means you're going to get half as many charged seeds out, but then a number of spare inert seeds, and we'll look at those in a moment. But then you get a load of other useful stuff out, like plastic and stone, spoilage, ice, concrete, protein, yada yada, all the way down there. And there we go, that's the stone that we need. And so now we've got this running, every time we harvest one of these coral things, we can then chuck all of that in here, and a load of stone and some other stuff will come flooding out the bottom. Now, we don't want the spoilage, so that's immediately pulled out, dumped into a recycler and demolished like that. We don't want the glass either at the moment, because we have plenty of that coming out from the systems below, I think, and to be honest, I don't think we really need it for anything in particular, so it's just getting, again, demolished. And then finally, we also don't need the plastic because we're getting loads of that out from the normal scrap processing. And as you can see up here, we have plenty of scrap. So we're chucking that into recyclers here to destroy as well. So the main thing that's coming through down here is the stone, and the ice we could probably destroy as well because I don't think we care about that. Blue circuits are useful though, so we'll keep those. And then they run down a belt all the way down into here, under here, and then they're fed in to join in with all of the stuff that's coming through from the normal recycling. And once again, this is jammed up, this time on, it appears to be concrete, so we've got too much concrete and we can't dispose of it all, but we're getting through it gradually. So we're going to need to do a bit of tweaking around here to make some of the things run perhaps a little bit faster, have better overflows, something like that, because at the moment Fulgora is struggling a bit. But largely we are processing through most of the stuff that's coming out from the system up there, and things are running reasonably smoothly. A little bit of work is going to be required, as I say. So back to the Coralmium. As I said, we do get the seeds coming out of it, so we get the energized seeds, that's these bright blue ones, and we get the unenergized seeds or de-energized seeds coming out, and those are the duller colour ones, which makes a certain amount of sense. It's easy to tell which is which. And the energized ones are the ones that you can actually plant, so we bring them back over to the towers, and we put them in here, and then in theory we can plant them. The problem is, they are another one of those things that spoils. Now, they take half an hour to spoil, so it's not too bad, but eventually, after sitting in one of these towers for a little while, they will eventually spoil. If they are in the tower when they spoil, they can eventually be planted in inverted commas, where they will instantly mature, ready to be harvested again, but yielding one dull seed. As you can see, an inert Coralmium seed will grow into an inert Coralmium seed. And this means that you don't get stuck with the spoiled version sitting in the towers, which is a good thing, and means we won't run into the problem we saw on Foliax a little while ago, which has since been fixed in some of the mod updates, where we could end up with a seed spoiling in the inserter hand here, and then not getting put into the tower, and therefore completely jamming the system up. That has now been fixed, so a Foliax planter will now be able to plant any spoilage that ends up in it. And then once it's and the spoilage will immediately grow into a spoilage tree, which can be harvested, turns into spoilage, and then gets dumped out onto the belt here, meaning that the agricultural tower can carry on and go back to planting the proper seeds. So it all works very, very nicely over here, and it all works in pretty much exactly the same way over on Fulgora as well. So we can get rid of these dull seeds and be able to keep planting things. The seeds will also be spoiling to an extent when they're sat on the belt, which is a bit of a shame, but oh well, c'est la vie, what can you do? But we don't have a way of revitalising them until they have spoiled completely, so I've set up the system over here to only put a relatively limited number of them onto the belt. All the seeds that come out of the recycling will immediately be put straight onto the belt and flow around here as well, because there's no point in hanging on to them. They're not going to get any better. There's no point in storing them. We might as well just let them flow around here and be used as required. But over here, we have a system that will attempt to bring them back to life again, and that we don't want to run unless there's an actual good reason to. So all of the dull seeds are coming through this way, including any that end up on this belt, because they'll be pulled out by these inserters, dropped onto the belt that comes down here, and then be filtered out here and passed back round again. And then they're being put into a chest for storage purposes, and we're keeping an eye on the number in this chest, and if it ever gets over 400, then we're going to dump them into the recycler here to churn them up and destroy them. And then, well, I've only put in one recycler because I'm being lazy, so we'll then dump any of them that make it through the recycling onto the belt up here, but that will only be a quarter of them, so it's not a serious problem. They can just flow around and be dumped back in again. I decided I wasn't going to worry about that. It was also too slow, so I put in a second recycler here. Maybe I should speed module them, but at the moment it's working absolutely fine. However, the 400 or so that actually will stay in here can then be used when necessary. They can be put into this machine here when we see that there are fewer than 10 on the belt. Now at the moment we've got 231, 232, and I think that's because I ended up with rather a lot on there that I didn't really mean to put onto that belt. But we are monitoring it from here. We're monitoring the whole belt system, and if that does ever get below 10, then we can use this machine to do Coralmium seed repolarization, which takes in an inert seed and some of the electrolyte and turns it into a charged seed, and therefore will start it working again. The problem with this system is that it requires electrolyte. And if you remember from what we were talking about before, the electrolyte comes from over here, but to make electrolyte requires sand. And so when I first set the system up and it was all basically dead, I had to actually go over to the planet and I think recycle some of the Coralmium myself in my pockets, and then get that smashed up into sand in order to bring it, and then prioritise bringing it over here in order to make the electrolyte. And of course the electrolyte also requires the holmium solution, which is made over here, and that also requires sand. So this meant it was a little bit difficult to get the system bootstrapped and started up, and I am a little bit worried that if this system ever fails, then we may struggle to get it restarted. So it's certainly not capable of restarting itself. However, in an attempt to make it as safe as possible, I've put pumps on the electrolyte output. So over here we've got a pump that will dump into here until there is 5,000 in the tank. So this should always keep this tank at 5,000. And then there's another pump at the bottom over here, which will only pump out when that tank at the top is over 3,000. So what this means is that the electrolyte will be pumped out over here, ready to be used by the seed revitalization process as a priority. And we will try and make sure there's always at least 3,000 in this tank. So we will stop pumping it out down here if there is less than 3,000. So if this ever drops below 3,000, all of the electrolyte that's produced will be pumped out this way, and we'll use it as a priority. But also, there's no point in having this tank completely full because we are still short of electrolyte for doing other stuff like making the science packs. And so I decided there's no point in filling this up above 5,000 because at that point we've got plenty in here to keep the revitalization running, but we'd like to be able to send any spare or any extra off this to be made into science. So this is a fairly careful balancing act, but I think I've got the numbers about right here. If we do get to a point where we have enough sand, then I would be very, very tempted to increase the number on here and just fill this tank up completely. But at the moment, because we're still a bit short of sand, I think doing it like this is probably the sensible way to go. As it is, it does seem to generally be working. You can see the resources flowing through here. We do have a certain amount of stone, as I was saying earlier. We do have a certain amount of jamming up going along through here, though, which is problematic. And as I was saying, we're also going to have to find a way to make this go a bit faster and to deal with the concrete more quickly. And also put in us somewhere to deal with all of this sand that's coming through, because as we've discussed, this is also going to be a problem. But we can just feed this in over here, and we'll actually be very, very glad of it. So in the short term, I could run a belt along here, like this. Now, to do this properly, we would add it onto all the bus systems and yada yada yada, just to make sure it runs nicely. But as a short-term solution, this will dump the sand straight through onto here, where it can then be passed through and made into a load more of the electrolyte over here. So, yeah, the sand is going to be useful, but we still need to make sure we can deal with the concrete a bit more effectively and efficiently. I guess technically this will actually provide a bootstrap possibility for if this system fails completely. So we won't be getting any stone out of here if the coralmium growing fails, but we will still be getting a little bit of sand out from the concrete recycling, which can be brought up to kickstart the system over here and get us that little bit of electrolyte to get the system back up and running over here. So maybe it's going to be something that will start itself back up again. We'll have to see what happens when it inevitably fails in the future. The next thing to look at is how this feels thematically for the planet. And we had quite a big debate about this on this stream, because the initial thought was, well, growing stuff on Fulgora doesn't feel quite right. The extra vanilla planets all have their very own strong themes. So Vulcanus, for example, it's the lava planet. You've got lava in these lakes over here. You pull that out of the lakes, you can then turn that into metal, which means you have a free resource and you can make massive quantities of absolutely everything that's remotely metal-based. Okay, that's lovely. Gleba is the agricultural planet, so you grow stuff on this planet. You grow enormous quantities of fruit with these with the agricultural towers, and then you process that and turn it into basically everything you could possibly need, which is perhaps a little over-ambitious with some of the things you're able to make, but it kind of works, it fits the theme. Even the metals are made from bacteria, which you grow in the biochambers, using them as sort of nutrient vat things, and you can produce a quantity of metal ores, which is a bit weird, but okay, it kind of sort of works, I suppose. It fits the theme. Fulgora is the planet of scrap, where you dig up enormous quantities of scrap out of the ground, and then you recycle that, and sort of the point of Fulgora is that when you process the scrap, you get quite advanced stuff out of it. So you get blue circuits, and if you want to have other green circuits, then you recycle the blue circuits to get green circuits out. You get low density structures, so if you need plastic, you have to recycle the low density structures to get the plastic out of them. You also get steel out of that, and copper out of that as well, which is slightly funny because you also get electrical cable and steel directly. So you get a bit of an excess of those, but never mind. If you want copper, then yes, you need to recycle the low density structures of the electrical cables. So the idea being that generally most of the normal resources you get come from taking the more complicated versions and recycling them. So all of the production chains work in reverse, and that's different and interesting. If you want iron, you have to recycle the gears. If you want wood, you recycle the wooden gears, and so on. And this is quite a nice process. It feels very, very different from the other planets. Aquilo has its own feel as well, but I won't talk about that until we get out there. However, putting in this coralmium production over here makes it feel more like you're growing things on the recycling planet. And that's a little bit weird and didn't quite sit right with me. Now, there was a bit of a debate and a discussion about this, and chat was suggesting that, well, it's okay, you are technically growing something, but it's a very Fulgoran themed growing, because you're growing rocks that are kind of just scraping sludge out of the oil, and you've got loads of the oil, and we're already okay with pulling the heavy oil out and turning it into solid fuel and that sort of thing. So why not have a type of coral that can dredge some other types of sludge out of it? And that's sort of okay. It makes a bit of sense. And if you look through here, some of these things that kind of fits. You need to have the seeds coming out to make the process work at all, which is slightly funny. Maybe it should have just been a mining drill equivalent that you put out on the oil and it pulls some of the sludge out. But that would have been maybe a bit too simple, and it would have felt exactly like harvesting the scrap, except that you'd have patches that never run out, and maybe that wouldn't have been quite the feel that we're going for here. So this does make it a little bit more challenging. And some of these things do fit with that. So plastic, you can sort of see how plastic might have formed in the oil, and you can get that, skim that off the surface. Stone definitely fits. If you've got coral growing, then you can smash stone out of it fine. Spoilage, again, similar. Ice, I don't know. Concrete, probably not. Having processing units in there, though, and low-density structures feels a bit weird, because those... they wouldn't really be just sludge you can scrape off the oil, and they don't really feel like they'd be part of the Coralmium structure to me. But then maybe they're bits that have been pulled up off the bottom of the lake because they got left there when the planet was abandoned. It was sort of just bits of electronics went everywhere. Maybe it sort of makes sense. Holmium ore definitely makes sense. I'm okay with that being pulled up from the ground because that's what a lot of this planet's made of. And maybe glass is sort of, I don't know. I think that doesn't necessarily need to be in there. It could be made from the stone. But then at this point, we're sort of starting to go, well, at that point, you're not really going in for the recycling theme that goes on this planet. If you want to be pulling up basic stuff, because that's what should come out of the ground if you've got just plants growing there. And maybe we should be pulling up stone and things in slightly more advanced states, which I guess at that point, that's what the concrete is. So you're pulling up the concrete, you can then recycle that down into bricks and then into sand, which is kind of the part of the stone that we care about, so maybe that makes it okay. I don't really know. I have complicated feelings about this system, and I don't really know quite how I feel about it. It doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the system. But then on the other hand is that we've ended up with the Coralmium system because we've picked up the recipes that are all about growing things on other planets. And so with the theme of that, it makes a certain amount of sense to be, well, growing things on other planets, because that's the point of all of those mods. I don't know. It was an interesting process to work through, though, so I'm quite happy to have it as a general system. I'm just not quite sure how I feel about it fitting thematically with the rest of the Fulgoran tech that we've got on this planet. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments, because it'd be nice to have a few extra opinions and feelings about the whole system, and maybe I can talk about it in an upcoming video. Initially getting the Coralmium seeds to start this process up and running was a little bit tricky, because we had one of those things where we've added in a new mod, and therefore you don't necessarily automatically spawn in the places where you get them from. However, we got quite lucky with this particular one, because it turns out you gather your initial ones from the huge Fulgoran ruins, and there were a few of those left on some of the islands. Not the one we've actually been building on, of course, because we've completely stripped that of all of its assets, and not even the one just next to it, because again, that was in sort of range of our hungry gathering earlier on in the streams. But I didn't have to go too far to find a few structures on some of the nearby islands, and I could rip up a few of those, and that got me my initial seeds, which I was able to chuck into the towers, and then allow them to grow, and then once they start running, you get about 2 seeds out for every seed you put in, although admittedly 3/4 of those come out as the dull ones. And so, in conclusion, looking at the system I've got set up over here, I'm generally pretty happy with it. It's working nicely. However, I think it needs to be expanded a bit so that it produces a bit more of all of the outputs. As you've noticed, there's not a huge amount coming through over here, and there's not a lot of stone coming in over here. So until we've got the stone starting to back up through the system, I would say that the whole thing is insufficient. That's going to be a little bit tricky to fit in because we don't have any more shallow oil available in the immediate growing area, and as I said earlier, you can't grow it in the deep stuff, so I'm probably going to have to put them in down here somewhere, which is going to make running the belts around a little bit funny, but never mind, I'm more than capable of doing that. The other part that is a serious problem at the moment is how quickly we're able to recycle the concrete. So I suspect what I'm probably going to end up doing is putting in an additional recycler to work with the concrete, but the question is, where do I put it and how do I link it in? So at the moment, the flow on all of these machines generally works pretty well. If you keep an eye on basically any of them. Let's look at the green circuits, for example. We've got a belt through here that takes the green circuits off to wherever they're needed. That's good. And also, there's a system here that grabs out any excess ones and puts them into this red box. So if they're needed anywhere by the logistics system, they can be grabbed and put into there. And that actually has priority over the ones that flow off down the belt. But that's fine. All of these are on the general output. Then, this comes back here, flows through here to where they're initially split off from the belt of everything coming through. So the green circuits will come around here, and they'll flow around this way as much as is required, and then any excess ones, if the belt is full, and okay, it's only full on one side, but let's pretend it's actually properly full, because that's something that doesn't work quite as we'd like it to. Any excess ones will then be taken out by this splitter, because you can see it's prioritised to take them out to this side, but if there's an excess, they'll then go this way. They'll end up with this inserter, which will then dump them into the recycler. Great. And exactly the same thing is happening with the concrete over here. It's being split off by this splitter, and then any excess can be taken by this inserter and put into the recycler so it can be demolished. The problem is there's no room around here to put in another recycler. This whole system is just a bit too compact and a bit too tight, so there's no way to get another recycler in here to deal with that. And that's a slightly tricky one. And now I did come up with a possible idea for fixing this, and that's to put in another recycler somewhere possibly downstream, like over here, and put in an inserter to feed it, and then link that inserter to the other inserter that's feeding into this machine over here, and then say I want to read the hand content as a whole, so it'll feed anything out on there, and then at the other end we set this one up to enable when anything is greater than 0. So when there's any signal on the on the wire at all, then we'll enable this inserter. And that means whenever this inserter picks up anything, so whenever there is an excess of concrete, therefore this one is running, it will send a signal over to this one and tell this one to run as well. So they'll be in perfect sync with each other, and we'll see if this works. Well, it's stopped now, because this recycler is still running. Okay, it's not going quite as well as I hoped. But there we go. When this one runs, it does send the signal over to here, and so this one will run as well. Now, I don't think it's going to be running quite as extensively as this one is, but it's a good start and will hopefully get a little bit more flowing through. Now, the other side of that is we then need to deal with all of the output coming out of here. So this is going to be stone bricks and iron ore. I could put another recycler here next to this one, and then that will be producing sand and a small amount of iron ore. So at that point, I guess I have a splitter here, a filter splitter on the output of here that will take the sand one way, where it can be taken off to go up here into this system, and then the iron ore can be then put through another pair of recyclers just to demolish that. The other, and probably slightly neater system, would be to take the output from here and then feed it back into the inputs over here, as if it was just then another one of these in parallel. But that's going to require more belts and more stuff, so I don't know whether it's going to be worth it. This system looks quite fun and kind of functional, and could be finished off like this, with a couple more recyclers on the end to deal with the iron ore, and then any sand that comes out being sent off this way up the belt. I do think this should work, but also it is 4 more recyclers to do the job of basically 1 more recycler, which seems a little bit wasteful in space, but I don't think that's a serious problem. I have also blocked up this row completely, so if we ever do need concrete further down the belt, it's not going to work at all. So this is a dirty system for dealing with it, but I think it will probably work well enough. And I think that brings you up to date on the Coralmium. As I say, we need a bit more of it and we need to process it a bit better, but the basic system is up and working, and we're starting to produce stone, which means we're going to have some sand, which means then we can hopefully start to have some electrolyte, and therefore we'll start to have science packs again. Phew! So if you'd like to copy along and try and see if you can build up your own version of this system, then grab the Planetary Pioneers mod from the Factorio mod portal, stick it in on your Factorio install, and yeah, you'll have all the same planets, all the same quality of life mods as we do. If you use the seed 11111, then you should end up in the same universe as us with all the same planets, and you'll be able to build your own builds on the same shapes of islands that we're playing with and all that sort of thing. If you'd like to see us carrying on with all of these planets and making new solutions for everything, including our new planet of Pelagos, then come along for the stream at 7:30 PM UK time. I'll also be streaming at 8 PM on Wednesdays, where I should be currently playing Foundry, but I'm quite close to the end of that, so we'll see how that goes and whether I'm still on that by the time you're watching this video. And the videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday. So, thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video and we'll stick around. See you next time. Bye bye.